everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of Living on Purpose, the show about intentionally crafting the happiness and success you deserve. No, I am not about to announce my candidacy for anything. My wife suggested I show my support for our Olympic team. She loves the Olympics. I hope you had a great week, and whether you did or did not, I hope you're preparing for a great weekend. I'm your host, Mark Barton, author of the Living on Purpose course and creator of the Happiness Success Cycle method. I'm also the owner of Bought In for the Win LLC, a coaching, consulting, and training and development company. If what you experience from this show resonates with you, please use the contact information at the end of the video to connect with me and learn more about how I might be of service to you or your organization. Now, on with the show. So, if you tuned into last week's episode, I talked about aligning your purpose and values, and I gave some examples on how to do that on a personal, organizational, or leadership level. This week, we're going to spend some time focusing on one of my personal favorites, mental conditioning. As a visionary type person, I love the practice of mental conditioning because it not only prepares me for possible outcomes, but allows me to see ones that I may not have previously considered and opens my horizons. It's important to point out that mental conditioning is the sixth step in the process, and it intentionally occurs immediately after decision making and building accountability. So as I explain mental conditioning, keep in mind these other two parts of the process have already occurred. So what exactly is mental conditioning and how do we do it? Conceptually, mental conditioning isn't really much different than physical conditioning in that there's usually a specific routine that we should follow with some targeted focused areas through specific exercises. When we start mental conditioning, we refer back to a specific prior decision we made. But mental conditioning is not only a reflective process. In fact, it should be much more future focused as we prepare ourselves for any set of possible outcomes that might result from the decision we made. Essentially, the decision we made is not finished playing out in our life. Or if it has, we're not simply focusing on what has already passed, but rather how it could be different if we had to make the same decision again or experience something similar in the future. I like to refer to mental conditioning as intentional daydreaming because while we're allowing our mind to wander so that we can mentally experience different outcomes, both successes and failures, we have to be mindful of a few specific areas. First, in the initial part of mental conditioning, when we're reviewing the decision we made, we need to think about any gaps in our decision-making process. These gaps might come from things like not considering cultural values other than your own, not considering past experiences of others, and any new information that you may not have had when you made the decision. Also, considering some alternative analysis and like piecing information together differently. Once we've considered any gaps we identified, we can start creating and visualizing the what if and if then scenarios of a variety of different possible outcomes. We should allow ourselves to intentionally have these visualizations go to the extremes and take conscious time to wander down all the different mental paths that our brains will take us on. One of the most important parts of mental conditioning is taking time to identify the different feelings we experience or how we are affected with an A as in emotion, as we're letting our mind wander. As I explained last week, emotions are the result of a particular impact on our values. So it's important to recognize how these different imaginary scenarios made us feel because we can identify whether or not that experience is positively or negatively impacting our values and which particular values it might be affecting. This is the part that makes the daydreaming intentional. When we do this effectively, a couple of different things start to develop, so let's look at them individually. The first thing we develop from effective mental conditioning is grace in the face of failure. When we review our decision-making process and we understand where the failure point is, it makes it a lot easier to forgive yourself, not place blame, or any other behaviors that might result in a depressive downward spiral. It gives us the ability to make those corrections going forward and say, okay, last time I zigged right here and I should have zagged. Now that we have the confidence to know we can do it right the next time, or at least less wrong. The second thing we develop from mental conditioning is a growth mindset. By identifying our shortcomings, we become mindfully aware of how we can improve. This makes improvement a matter of choice and not ability. It also gives us a greater ability to be adaptable as circumstances change. So when we're doing mental conditioning and going through all these visualizations, what we're really doing is intentionally exploring all of the possible outcomes of a given life experience. This includes not only any failures or anticipated setbacks, but we should also consider outcomes that exceed our success expectations. Whether or not we ever experience any of them is irrelevant, but if we do, It allows us to be a lot more prepared and it should affect us a lot less. It's sort of a form of desensitization, which allows us to remain unnerved if and when any of those do happen. Let's look at some specific examples at the personal, organizational, and leadership levels to better understand the importance of good mental conditioning. Personal mental conditioning is very easy and can be quite entertaining and comical if you let it. It's like having your own free TV shows in your head and you're the star. You just pick a situation in your life and then think about all the different possible ways it could go. Let me explain one recent example I have. I recently resodded my entire back and front yard. I decided to do this probably 3 years ago. Since making the decision, every single time I cut the grass, I spent time mentally conditioning about not only what the end result would be, but more importantly, how the process would go. I did this more frequently and more in depth as the time got closer and I was getting ready to actually act on that decision. When the day of came, I thought I had a pretty good game plan going into things. I had scheduled the delivery of the landscaping materials and the sod accordingly. I knew what equipment rentals I needed to get and had reserved those. I was all set to start at dawn, coffee in hand. About 3 hours into the process, I realized that I had severely underestimated the scale of this operation and was on my way to Home Depot to rent a front-end loader and a large dump trailer. Although I had to make many changes in the process, which were also costly, none of them really bothered me because I still hadn't reached anywhere near the worst case scenario of having to abandon the entire project and hire someone to come do it for me, and I hadn't died of heat exhaustion yet. So, many of the setbacks that I faced were time consuming and the project took more time, effort, energy, and money than I had originally anticipated. The end result always remained the same. The project got completed, and last week I was able to cut the new grass for the first time. Shortly after that, my wife and I were talking about how great the new grass looked. While I felt joy and accomplishment with the end result, I was still able to say that, as beautiful as it is, it's exactly how I envisioned it 3 years ago when I first decided to do it, and all the subsequent reimagining I've done along the way. I expected the unexpected in the setbacks of the actual process, was able to identify and relish my small victories I was having along the way, and never lost sight of the feeling I was pursuing at the end of the whole thing. As I said, personal mental conditioning is relatively easy, but it gets a bit more complicated when you start incorporating others, so let's talk about different ways of organizational mental conditioning. The simplest example of organizational mental conditioning I can give you comes from sports, and it's called practice. Good sports teams study their opponent and prepare a game plan to counter what their opponent is going to do. This is very simple mental conditioning and makes a great example of those if-then scenarios. Great sports teams, on the other hand, not only anticipate their reactions to their opponent, but also to themselves. I've coached, watched, and cheered for more than one team that started to fall apart just as fast as they started to become successful because they never spent enough time preparing to be successful. And when it happened, they didn't know how to handle it, so negative behaviors crept back in. When we talk about organizational mental conditioning, we have to prepare for both losing and winning, and it has to be a collective effort and a collective preparation. In other organizations, mental conditioning can look a little different, but it's really still a form of practice. Anytime you have organizational training, it's an opportunity for organizational mental conditioning. If proper forethought is put into creating scenario-based training, it's likely to be a lot more effective and employees or members will be a lot more apt to handle changes as a result. Organizational mental conditioning does not always have to be training focused. For example, if leadership is considering implementing a new policy, it would be a really good idea and a great form of mental conditioning to put the policy out as an idea before implementing it and ask the organization's members to provide feedback of how this would impact them. This allows everyone to reflect on it at an individual level, a small unit level, and from the perspective of the organization as a whole. This kind of organizational mental conditioning allows members to both give and receive grace with any shortcomings that might result from the changes, allows them to identify opportunities to grow with the organization, and helps them build resilience to the impacts of change. Effective organizational mental conditioning is not only healthy for the individual, but also in the organization as a whole, but does a lot to help build effective leaders. Let's take a deeper look at how mental conditioning can be applied specifically at the leadership level. Mental conditioning from a leadership perspective is almost as easy as the personal level. You simply have to choose the leadership decision and then spend some time envisioning all the possible outcomes. Where it differs from personal mental conditioning is that the leader has to do it from two perspectives. First, they have to consider the decision from the perspective of the individuals that they lead and how it will impact them personally, and then also have to do it from the consideration of the organization as a whole. Let me give you a real simple example. Let's say that the boss has made the decision to fire the payroll clerk for some legitimate reason. It would be good leadership to do some mental conditioning and think about how this is going to impact the rest of the employees if he fires the payroll clerk on Thursday and nobody gets paid on Friday. And I can almost guarantee you this is going to cause an organizational level problem when everybody's pissed off and they did not get paid. Now, while this might seem like a comical example, the fact is this happens every single day when leaders don't take the time to fully think about the decisions that they're making, or don't broaden their scope enough to consider the impact of their decisions from the perspective not only of the organization, but also the individual members that make up the organization. Regardless of what type of leadership decision you're making, effective mental conditioning allows you to stay ahead of crises, emergencies, and even abundant successes so that those you lead can look to you as the calm in the storm to guide them through. Effective mental conditioning is not just a good idea for leaders, it's a responsibility you have to your subordinates. As much as physical conditioning is good for the body, mental conditioning is good for the mind, but it's also good for the heart and soul. You can use the same techniques to focus specifically on emotional, social, or spiritual conditioning as well. Mental conditioning does not have to be some deep meditative process. It can be as simple as running an idea by somebody else just to get a different perspective. Just remember that anytime you do any form of mental conditioning, you're building grace for yourself, creating opportunities for growth, and developing resilience to variation. As you become more aware of how the different outcomes make you feel, you're more able to pursue the ones that enrich you. And I don't know about you, but I like the idea of being enriched. I'll see you back here next week, but until then, take some time to do some mental conditioning this week and continue to invest in yourself. Because if you aren't bought in, you're sold out.